Welcome to today's Explainer, where we are going to dive headfirst into humanity's oldest and, honestly, most mind-bending philosophical puzzle. How exactly do we account for the immense, intricate order of our universe? And, perhaps more importantly, does all that order point to a creator? You can think of today's session as a masterclass, an expansive look where we'll literally try to map out the very structure of reality. I am absolutely thrilled to be your guide through this material, so let's unpack some of the most profound arguments ever constructed by the human mind.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to kick things off with the search for first causes, then map out arguments from design, morality, and being. After that, we'll dive into Hindu cosmology, and finally, we'll confront the ultimate philosophical heavyweight, the problem of evil. We've got a ton of fascinating ground to cover, so let's just jump right in.
All right, part 1, the search for first causes. Let's unlock the fundamental structure of reality. Okay, so let's start with the basics. Cosmology, in a purely philosophical sense, is all about studying how reality is ordered. When you look at the world, you constantly see cause and effect, right? Things moving, things changing. Think of it like a massive, basically infinite chain of falling dominoes. Now, for millennia, philosophers have stared at this cascading chain of cause and effect in nature and thought, well, they couldn't have just started falling on their own out of nowhere. There absolutely has to be a definitive first mover or a first cause that kick-started the entire cosmos. Someone, or something, had to flick that very first domino.
And observing that meticulously ordered universe brings us right to our next section, teleological proofs, or the argument from design.
Thomas Aquinas hit the nail on the head with this one back in the day. He argued that non-intelligent things in nature still somehow act toward really specific goals. Think about it. A tiny seed automatically grows into a massive tree. Giant planets perfectly orbit the sun. He notes this doesn't just happen by sheer random chance. So Aquinas gives us this brilliant real-life analogy. Picture an arrow flying through the air, heading straight for a bullseye. The arrow itself? It has no brain, no intelligence. It's just a piece of wood. If it's moving toward a specific goal, it absolutely requires an archer to aim it. Therefore, he concludes, some overarching intelligent being must exist to direct all these mindless natural things toward their goals. Jump forward a few centuries, and the philosopher William Paley takes this idea and runs with it, giving us his absolutely legendary biological analogy. Imagine you're just taking a stroll down a sandy beach, and you trip over a shiny brass pocket watch. You pick it up, pop it open, and see these incredibly intricate, gleaming gears, coils, and springs, all ticking away in perfect synchronization to tell time. You wouldn't just shrug and assume the sand and waves randomly pushed all those tiny metal pieces together, right? No way! You'd instantly assume there was a watchmaker. Paley argued that if we apply that exact same logic to the staggering, mind-blowing complexity of the human eye, with its cornea, retina, and optic nerve all working in perfect harmony, it logically demands a divine designer.
But hold on. What if the proof isn't actually found in physical design at all? Let's move to section 3 and look at objective morality and the actual logic of being.
Enter the 11th century philosopher Anselm of Canterbury. He decided to try and prove God's existence purely through logical deduction. We call this an a priori proof. This means he completely bypassed physical evidence, no pocket watches, no eyeballs. Instead, he starts with this incredibly specific, honestly kind of mind-bending definition. He states, God is a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Just let that sit for a second. He is deliberately setting up a very clever logical trap for us.
So Anselm structures this almost like a geometric math proof. Actually, scratch that, it's more of a thought experiment. He asks us to imagine a painter. First, the artist has a brilliant vision of a masterpiece in their head. That's what we call intramental. Then they actually paint it, and it exists in the physical world. That's extramental. Anselm asserts, and we'd probably all agree, that a masterpiece is undeniably greater when you can actually touch it and see it in physical reality, rather than it just being a daydream in someone's head. So, if we apply this to his definition, if God is literally the greatest conceivable being, and existing in reality is fundamentally greater than just existing in your imagination, well then logically, God must exist in reality, because if he didn't, you could conceive of something even greater. It's a wild mental exercise, isn't it?
All right, let's broaden our horizons. Section 4. Karma and Hindu cosmology. Let's see how the order of cosmic justice plays into all this.
Now, we throw the word karma around a lot today in casual conversation, right? Like, oh man, that's bad karma. But philosophically speaking, in Hindu traditions, it operates as a strict universal law of cause and effect. But we're not just talking about physical dominoes falling here. This is intrinsically tied to moral actions and justice across the entire cycle of rebirth, or samsara. It's a cosmic ledger. If you cause harm, you incur a karmic debt. If you do good, you retain a reward. And this brings us to a really fascinating argument for the divine. A lot of Hindu philosophers argue that a flawlessly ordered system of cosmic justice couldn't possibly just manage itself. Think about it. Keeping track of literally every single moral action, every debt, and every reward across all past, present, and future lives, that requires a conscious, divine administrator. The order of karma essentially implies a divine accountant. But to be totally fair to the richness of this tradition, ancient skeptic schools, like the Mimamsa tradition, push back on this. They argue that these universal rules are just eternal. They're woven into the fabric of reality, much like gravity, meaning no divine oversight is actually needed for it all to function perfectly.
Okay, Section 5. We've reached the most dramatic intellectual counterweight in our whole syllabus. We have to confront the ultimate philosophical challenge, the problem of evil. Up to this point, we've marveled at the beautiful, intricate order of the universe, but we cannot ignore the undeniable reality of suffering. This paradox forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable Socratic question that really challenges the foundation of everything we've talked about so far. If there truly is an all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving architect who designed this entire cosmos, why is there so much intense, agonizing suffering? Philosophers generally slice this challenge into two distinct frameworks. First, you've got David Hume's logical problem. Hume essentially plays the skeptic here, dismantling the very attributes of a perfect creator. He argues, look, if God knows about the suffering, wants to stop it, and actually has the power to stop it, then suffering shouldn't exist. Period. Since it undeniably does exist, one of those divine attributes logically has to be false. Then you have William Rowe's evidential problem. Rowe doesn't just treat this like a logic puzzle. He points to the sheer volume and intensity of completely unnecessary, preventable suffering in the real world. He argues that this massive mountain of evidence makes the existence of a wholly good, omnipotent being highly, highly improbable.
So how on earth do defenders of these cosmological frameworks respond to that? Let's look at our final section, Rethinking Evil's Nature.
It's amazing to see how philosophers across different cultures have developed wildly different ways to reconcile this. Let's compare two totally contrasting perspectives. First, the classical Western view, championed by St. Augustine. He argued something highly counterintuitive. He said that evil isn't actually real. It's not a thing that was created and placed into the world. Rather, evil is simply a privation, a lack or an absence of good, just like darkness is merely the absence of light, or cold is just the absence of heat. Therefore, a perfect creator didn't actually invent evil. But if we completely shift our paradigm, the Yoruban African perspective offers a totally different vibe. In their cosmology, the agency of evil isn't just a human failing or a creator's flaw. It is driven by distinct cosmic spirits called the Ajagun. In this view, evil has a much more grounded definition. It's the destruction of life. And crucially, it's viewed as a natural, necessary contrast to goodness, rather than some big theological paradox that a supreme creator needs to solve.
So, as we wrap up this masterclass, I want to leave you with one final, provocative thought. We've seen absolutely incredible arguments for design today, from the archer's flying arrow to the microscopic gears of the human eye, to the pure mathematical logic of our own minds. Yet, we've also stared directly at the chaotic, painful reality of suffering. So what does it all mean? Does our universe's delicate balance of breathtaking design and deep suffering point us to a grand architect, to eternal, unthinking forces, or perhaps to something we haven't even figured out how to conceive of yet? Thank you so much for exploring these massive ideas with me today. Keep questioning, keep learning.